special side quest episode of Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm one of your hosts, Madelyn.
I'm your other host, Emma.
And this week, in lieu of our usual side quest format, because let's be honest, Emma and I have been in Japan for 2 weeks and we just got home, and how many video games have we played? You know, an indeterminate amount.
Maybe some. Maybe a couple.
Maybe we have. I was just talking today about how I think that the plane ride would be a great time to play some video games.
Mm-hmm.
But also, we're in a jet-lagged fog in real-world time where I can't imagine any podcast that we tried to record after we arrive home on Saturday would be anything coherent.
No, probably not. I mean, you know, how coherent are they on a normal basis, but this would just be beyond the pale, probably.
That's what I'm saying. The bar has not been set very high, which means there's not very much left to go down before it's just us babbling, like, absolutely incoherently.
Yes.
So this week, instead of doing our usual news magazine rundown, we got a very special side quest, where instead, we're going to be giving you a taste of the presentation that we gave last month at the Popular Culture Association's annual conference. In that presentation, at that conference, it was titled Skip Cutscene, Gameplay Mechanics as Storytelling. To be honest, I don't really feel like that title is like super, it's still catchy, right? It's like a nice catchy title. Does it really dovetail with what our actual research, although that feels weird to call it that, but it did really dovetail with what our actual presentation was really about?
Not really.
But hey, it's catchy title. Gameplay Mechanics as Storytelling, a methodology.
We should really just change it to that.
Yeah, catchy title. Video game reference. So what we'll be doing is giving a little bit more of an informal, relaxed version of that presentation because no one is timing us for it to be exactly 15 minutes. And of course, you won't have the benefit of our incredibly helpful visual aids. Maybe we'll find a way to embed those on the blog post for this somehow.
We probably will not be doing that.
Maybe I will try to figure out a way to do that.
Unless we're just linking it. Editor Emma will not be doing that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Maybe I'll at least send you the, in the blog post we can maybe at least put the filled out, picture of our axes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So you'll get the taste of it without the help of our tremendous PowerPoint, which, not to brag or anything, but the PCA Game Studies Twitter said was excellent.
Yeah.
So, you'll have to be sorry you missed that. Sorry you weren't in DC and didn't catch it live. But this is the next best thing. The podcast Redux review. Skip Cutscene, Gameplay Mechanics as Storytelling. So, Emma, any further setup you want to give for this before we dive on in?
I don't think so.
All right. I can't remember. I started out by reading the thesis. This is a strong start here. So
it even has the things in the speaker notes. So.
Oh, it does. It does. I forgot my own name for a second there. Anyway, so launching into this presentation now. So our thesis, what we're talking about in this presentation, is basically that mechanics can be mapped onto a scale of power and control that they give to the player in order to consider their impact on game narrative and their role as a storytelling tool. So basically what we're saying here is we've created this methodology by which you can look at a given mechanic and based on these two metrics, think about how it impacts player experience of the game. And that's really helpful from a developer's perspective and just from someone who's interested in a critical analysis of games perspective to figure out why given moments in the game are working or aren't working or why they function the way that they normally do.
So before we get into that, I think we thought it would be useful to sort of give a definition of what a mechanic is. So we had a couple of academic definitions. One of which is using concepts from object-oriented programming as methods invoked by agents designed for interaction with the game state, or the means to guide the player into particular behavior by constraining the space of possible plans to attain goals, which are from Miguel Sicart and Aki Jarvinen. respectively. But basically, what you can sort of parse that down into is it's what an agent can do in the game world. So what verbs are they enacting within the game world? And specifically for our thing, we're looking at the agent as the player. You could look at it from an AI perspective too, but specifically we're looking at what the player can do in the game world. So they can run in the game world. They can fight in the game world. It's those verbs, basically.
So how this presentation is going to work, this podcast presentation, is that we're going to take a bunch of examples of various mechanics from various games and talk about how they fall into this methodology that we're going to present to you right now. One little note about that is we're looking at things at sort of like the second level up. If we wanted to get really, really pedantic, we could look at a really micro level of like the punches, the different in like a really, really, really like low down, like as far down as you can break up a mechanic. We're going to be looking like one level above that, which I think is still going to be really functionally useful without having to get into incredible nitty gritty, boring detail. So the first portion of this sort of mechanical axes that we're developing here is control. So we're looking at power and control. So control, basically, if we're imagining this as a geometry class flashback to that XY grid, right? Control is our x-axis. Control, basically, as we define it, is the breadth of ability within a given mechanic. So if we select a mechanic from a game, how many different things can you do with that? How many different ways can you use it to interact with the game world? So the more control that a player has, that generally evokes a feeling of having more freedom as you interact with the game. It makes obstacles potentially seem less intimidating, right? If you can approach problems in different ways, in ways that might feel easier to you or harder to someone else, you can sort of play with your level of difficulty there, right? But it gives you different ways to attack different problems, and in many ways, it's an easy way of producing that out-of-the-box feeling of fun. If you feel like you really get to interact with how you play the game, it makes you feel like you're having fun, and isn't that the point of games?
You always get so sarcastic sometimes when you wrap up on these slides occasionally.
I don't know.
I ever noticed, like, when we practiced it, too, like, beforehand, you would always, like, get off on a tangent in which you ended up with something sarcastic at the end, or something that sort of sounded sarcastic.
I didn't mean that in a sarcastic way. Having fun is the point of games a lot of the time. That's fine.
Maybe it's just because I can see, like, the hand motions you're doing with it.
That must be it. My sarcastic
She's sort of
hand
like
motions.
Moving her fists like next to her face.
Yeah. Well, this next slide is where you really start to miss out on the incredible artwork, because Emma did some really great cartoons to illustrate the example, the sort of clarifying example she's going to give right now.
Yes, we can sort of look at control and power in the next part. But look at control through, like, the lens of a single mechanic. So let's say a mechanic is you can destroy buildings, right? So in a case where with low control, there's a specifically marked building that is the one that you can destroy with whatever powers you're using to destroy that building, right? Whether you have bombs or telekinetic powers or whatever. But there's that one special building. Maybe it's outlined differently. Maybe it's yellow. It stands out from the other buildings. You know that's the one that you can interact with. Whereas in a case with high control, every single building is destructible, right? You can do whatever you want. Pick whatever building and you can break it however way you want. You can partly break it, you can fully break it, you can leave it be, etc., etc. And
the specific mechanic we're talking about here is green telepathy destruction, FYI, just because you can't
Actually, I literally just said that it could be any mechanic, but yes, in the image, it is green telepathy.
I realize it could be anything, but
also,
I just
it's not.
clear.
Also, it's not telepathy; it's telekinesis. Right?
You're right. That's embarrassing. It could be something else. It could be like green lightning. I don't know. I thought it was a telekinetic power. I did it again. Anyway, speaking of power, power in our definition, so we talked about control as the x-axis, power sort of being our y-axis here. So it's our depth of ability within a mechanic. So if control measures how many different things you can do within a mechanic, power measures how much impact those things that you do have. oftentimes how much impact they have narratively. So the more power a player has, that makes the player feel more important, right? It definitely is often used to increase player identification, right? If you're making the choices and that has an impact on your character's life, that makes you feel closer to the character. And it also makes your player character feel like they're the center of the game world, right? You're shaping the story as you play.
So going back to that building example, in a case where you have low power, the path of destruction you wrought, you leave it behind for a bit, you go to a different area, right? You load in and load out. And when you come back, all the buildings that you destroyed are standing up again, looking normal. Nobody remembers the terror and awe of your power that they felt. NPCs are just going around their business, so everything's back the same way it was before you came through. Whereas in cases with high power, everything you destroy stays that way, or you see it sort of get rebuilt in a manner that feels appropriate, like you see people actually like rebuilding the building that you destroyed. But basically you see that there is sort of like an effect on the world, right? People talk about you, maybe they're like, stop building destroyer, I'm gonna arrest you now, or something to that effect. And there's just marked consequences for what you've done, essentially.
That was some good dialogue you wrote there.
That's how I would do the NPCs. Stop you, building destroyer. I shall now arrest you. Do not resist with your green telepathy. That is telekinesis.
We've called it telepathy just as like, it's like a freaker zombie thing.
Except telepathy is the actual thing.
Shh.
Okay. So with all that in mind, we get actually into our methodology now that we've explained what a mechanic is, what control is, and what power is. So our proposed methodology is applied best to a single mechanic, right? You either pick it at a single point in the game, or you can look at it over the course of the game by picking out several points and sort of assessing it. And in order to do that, you select the mechanic, you select the given point that you're looking at it as, you sort of take the mechanic out a little bit and look at its power and control values. So how much power is it assigning the player and how much control is it assigning the player. And then you sort of look at that mechanic based on what is happening in the narrative. What's the tone of this scene? Like, what is the player supposed to be feeling? And also see how it interacts with other mechanics that are happening at the same time to either sort of readjust where you placed it on the power control spectrum, or to see if the place it is on the power control spectrum is appropriate and is working in the way that you wanted it to at that moment. So it's very context specific, this methodology. You can't just take combat as a mechanic and place it on this quadrant just for all games, right? Or even for a single game, you can't just take the combat mechanic and place it and that's it. You have to look specifically at a certain point in order to place it and really assess it in this way.
So we found it useful to plot this in terms of this XY axis graph. Of course, we're not, in traditional XY axis, right, you have positive and negative. We're really thinking about this as 4 quadrants in the first quadrant of a traditional graph. Is this visualization getting hard enough for you yet? But by dividing it into these 4 quadrants, we're sort of able to categorize general ideas of where certain mechanics that we're going to examine fall. So what we're going to start out with is case studies of high power and high control, and we'll move through all 4 of these quadrants to give you an idea of how this methodology works. So Emma, take it away.
So one of the examples that we chose as sort of our primary case study in high power, high control is sort of dating mechanics. So things where there's some sort of visual novel aspect or dialogue choices, and you build relationships with people, so on and so forth. So specifically, we looked at Persona 5 as an example of this. In Persona 5, you can date any woman who wants to talk to you, like, more than once. I think there's, like, I guess I could count on this slide. Let's see, how many women are there? There's 9 women who you can date. I think that's all of them. Yeah. Uh, they will all fall in love with you and be receptive to your advances. You can date one of them, two of them, three of them, or all 9 of them, if you so wish. There are some consequences to that, but it's entirely up to you, and they don't murder you and end the game if you decide to date all of them. So it's really up to you. It very much sort of places the protagonist in the romantic sense as the center of the universe. So you can choose whoever you want. You're able to start relationships with whoever you want. The game doesn't stop you, unless you're trying to date a guy, in which case, so it's not quite all the way up there on high power, high control, but it's pretty far up there.
Another really common and in many ways sort of intuitive example of high power, high control is pretty much any simulator game. So something like Zoo Tycoon, Roller Coaster Tycoon, SimCity, Restaurant Empire, pretty much any simulator type game is generally going to be based on a foundation of high power, high control mechanics, right? If I'm building my zoo at Zoo Tycoon, sometimes if I have all the expansion packs like we did, right? You've got hundreds of animals you can choose from, you've dozens of different types of trees and foliage you can put down, and because games like that don't have in many ways a very strong scripted narrative, you might have some objectives you have to hit. There's so many different ways that you can do that pretty much everything you do has an incredibly large effect on the game world, because there's not really anything like cutscenes or a forced path that you have to go on that's taking power away from you as the player. By creating your zoo, roller coaster, city, restaurant, whatever it is, you have all of the power. And of course, the quintessential example of that is The Sims, where oftentimes your control is even sort of wider than the access in some ways, because in The Sims, it's pretty much expected that you're going to use cheat codes to give yourself more money or whatever, make your sim naked or whatever it is that people do with cheat codes, right? I don't know. I don't play The Sims very much. But that even expands the control that you have, theoretically, further than the developers intended. So those are some really quintessential examples of high power, high control. Now we're going to go ahead and look at high power, low control.
So one example that we picked as a pretty clear demonstration of high power, low control is the morality system mechanic that specifically has a binary scale on which it measures your morality. So something like the infamous series or Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, you have your good side and your bad side, and eventually you kind of have to pick one. Not only because in some cases, like in Infamous, it sort of forces you into it at a certain point with a certain choice, but also because the cooler combat abilities are sort of tucked away on either end of the spectrum. So it very much encourages you to go full White Knight or full Black Rider. I don't know.
Nice.
whatever the opposite of a White Knight is. I guess a Black Knight. Whatever. Who cares?
Don't you mean full blue or full red?
Sure. Yes, I do. I mean full blue boy, full red riot, or whatever. Yeah, so that sort of creates a world in which there's very much shades of just black and white sort of things when it comes to being good or evil, and very much sort of has a big impact on the world and what happens to the characters and stuff like that, for not being able to really express perhaps your more complex opinions on good and evil.
Another type of game where high power, low control is pretty fundamental is games that, on the face of it, have sort of quote-unquote simple mechanics. What I'm thinking of here is games like QWOP or games like Tetris. Not to say that these games are easy or these games are simple. Anyone who's played these games is well aware that they are not easy and not simple. But if I was to make a list out of all the things that you could do in those games, or to look, for example, at movement in these games as a mechanic, how you can move things around. In QWOP, you've got 4 buttons to push, right? And in Tetris, you can rotate your piece around and move it around, and that's about it. this was a problem for us, right? When we did our episode on Tetris, and we tried to blow those many years ago, and we tried to make a mashup of Tetris, and there just weren't enough mechanics to mash it with anything without it just being, like, themed Tetris. Which would probably sell just fine, but here you don't have a lot of control, right? There's not that many things that you can do, but because the games are so, again, quote-unquote simple, everything that you do has a huge impact. Tetris, the only way that it proceeds, right, is based on your choices of how you move things around. In Quap, the only way that you win or lose, or not that you can really win or lose, but the only, the distance that your guy awkwardly runs is entirely dependent on the buttons that you push. So even though the control that you have is pretty limited, the power it gives you is huge. So we've got the top part of our graph filled out now. We're gonna look down at the bottom here and take a look at low power, high control.
So one primary case study we picked for this is sort of dialogue systems. A lot in general in games sort of fall under this, but we specifically picked Oxenfree as an example because of its singular ending. So Oxenfree is very much sort of a text-based adventure mystery type thing in which you have a lot of dialogue options where you talk to people and build your relationships and change other people's relationships. And in each dialogue option, there's either 3 different options. Sometimes it's sort of funnily all the same option, but generally they all give you different routes through the conversation, or you can choose to stay silent, you can choose to cut people off or not cut people off, and all of these have sort of impacts on how people perceive you until the very end, in which it's revealed sort of that there's no way out, essentially. So based on the interesting thing about this is because you have so much control in how you get to this ending, the ending can be perceived from entirely different viewpoints. So for one person, it might be tragically appropriate. For another person, it might be horrifically unfair, just because of the route they took to get to this same place.
And I think Oxenfree is so interesting because it makes you feel like you have high power for most of the game.
Yeah. Right up till the end, you think that you have a high amount of power. Until it pulls the rug out from under you.
And just to emphasize, and we'll say this a bunch, something having low power or low control is not a bad thing, right?
Yes.
In Oxenfree, it can be really, as Emma just said, it can make the narrative feel a lot of different ways to a lot of different people. And I feel like the sort of common critique of of games like Oxenfree or of games like the late Telltale Studios, right, is and whatever, I used to be one of these people, right? I still sympathize with these people of it didn't matter, right? Mm-hmm. My choices didn't matter, which is sort of the quintessential idea of this. I'm saying quintessential constantly, but it's sort of the idea of this, right? And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be impactful. Anyway, now it's time for the podcast exclusive bonus content. Cut for time from our actual presentation, but now I could include my beloved Katamari Damacy and the rolling mechanic in this high control, low power world, right? Because you can play Katamari all sorts of different ways, right? You can roll anything, you can roll in different directions, you can roll up different things, and yeah, you have to get bigger over time, but different ways you can roll through the world and the different things you can roll up, it's just I can't even imagine how many different Katamaris you could make. Right? Mm-hmm. But ultimately, the king still, reverse rainbow vomits, I guess that's called eating, you up into the cosmos. Most of the time he's pretty disappointed in you. The little girl feels the cosmos. It all proceeds exactly the same. This is a little bit different in levels like my least favorite level, like the Cowbear level, where your control is more limited, right? There are only certain things you can roll up. There are only certain ways you can end the game. So that's the bonus content, mostly for my amusement. But the really interesting thing about low power, high control mechanics is that Emma and I found in researching for this presentation that these kind of mechanics are really the bread and butter of like action adventure, first person shooter, survival horror type games. So things like drop systems for items, or weapon systems, or character selection, character skill trees, inventory systems, sort of more esoteric ones like the cap thing in Super Mario Odyssey, or just, your ability to proceed through a level with different paths. You see this in all sorts of games, right? In my lovely collage I have here, it's like we have Pokemon, we have X-Men Legends, or Marvel Ultimate Alliance, we have Kingdom Hearts, we have Lego Star Wars, Nathan Drake's over there, we have Borderlands, we have The World Ends With You, I could name a ton others. A lot of, I feel like, what should be fun about Days Gone, right, that we talked about last week, is that it's built on these kinds of mechanics that we see in these kinds of games over and over again. Not that there's anything wrong with that, right? I listed a bunch of games on there that are among some of our favorite games, right? I think that's safe to say. But if you're looking to make a game that is fun, out of the box, sort of feels like what a video game is, these low power, high control mechanics are sort of the quickest and easiest way to capture what that is, at least for us as a culture right now. So now that I've rambled about that for a while, let's talk now about sort of what I think is, in many ways, kind of the funkiest category, the low power, low control.
So for one of our examples for this, we chose Nier Automata, and specifically how it sort of points out where you have low power and low control in the narrative by sort of pretending to give you an option to, make a choice, quote unquote, that sort of goes against what the story is doing, right? So it'll let you, abandon your friend or abandon the mission, right? But it will launch you into sort of, a fake ending for the game, and roll the credits, real fast. So they'll give you, silly things, 2B decided that she really just wanted to go fishing because she was fed up with having to save the world all the time, or 9S just can't deal with his curiosity anymore, so he decides to run away and become a mad scientist or whatever. So it sort of points out yeah, you could do that, but that's not how the game goes, and that's not what you do. So it sort of rolls the credits and just resets you back where you started, to proceed in the appropriate route that the game's story wants you to take.
In a similar way that I didn't sort of connect until just now, quick time events are also, most of the time, a low power, low control situation. They're masquerading as a low control, high power mechanic, right? Because, yeah, it's pretty obvious you don't have that much control here, right? You have to press the button when they tell you to press the button. And, sometimes there are occasionally quick time events where, if you fail, that has an impact on the story, right? But the vast majority of the time, if you fail the quick time event, your character, dies or whatever. Spider-Man face plants into the flames. Batman doesn't manage to, defeat the fight. Whatever, right? Any number of quick time events you can think of. And
Jason!
You just you don't press X to Jason.
Jason!
Right?
Shaun!
Yeah, man, where do glitches fall in? That's another interesting category for research, right? But in these events, most of the time, okay, maybe your character dies, but you're just booted back to the beginning of the quick time event or to the checkpoint that you hit, and you just have to do it right? So you basically, the story is going to proceed how they've decided it's going to proceed. You just might have to try it a couple times to get your button pushes right. Man, this is making me think of all sorts of new things. DDR is kind of like that. Where does DDR fall, Emma? Is it a quick time event?
Kinda, yeah.
But, you can add your own style. I don't know. Anyway. Things that are popping into my head as I talk. Did you change the image for Phoenix Wright on this slide?
No, it was version? Like this. You just added it on your offline version, I think. I just added this to remind you to talk about something with Grim Fandango. But you added the stuff for the...
I know, but I didn't see Phoenix getting himself coffeed before.
Have you added these games to your 2 playlist yet? They're very good.
I need to. So another example of low power, low control that I think gets at where these mechanics can be very successful and create a lot of fun for people, even though using the word low twice makes it sound lame, right? Is point and click adventure puzzler games. So we're thinking of games like Phoenix Wright or like the Nancy Drew games or Grim Fandango, right? Which are not always, like, they're not games that, I mean, this is true of any game, right? They're not games that everyone cares for, right? You can go back and listen to the Grim Fandango episode and, like, was not my cup of tea. But games like that or Monkey Island or anything like that, these have huge followings and people love these games, even though the mechanics are basically like you can click on things and you have to put the right item in the right place. So even though you don't have that much power and you don't have that much control, they can still be really fun and satisfying because it's all about using the limited tools that you have to solve the puzzles. So just because something is low power, low control, doesn't mean it has to be like a lame QuickTime event that we're all gonna whine about. So, if only you could see our beautiful filled out graph now. It's gorgeous. I'm very proud of it. So to kind of wrap up our presentation here, Emma's going to talk a little bit about how power and control can evolve over time and how context is really important in determining these values.
So we touched on this a little bit with Oxenfree, where we pointed out that throughout the majority of the game, you sort of believe that you're in a high power, high control situation. And then it's revealed sort of at the end that you're actually in a low power, high control situation, which has a great effect on how the player feels about the narrative and the things that they did and what happened, etc. So in many cases in games, there might be a mechanic that sort of shifts either purposefully or in some cases, I'm sure, not purposefully along the power control chart, or something might happen that recontextualizes the mechanic's place on that chart. So we've talked about Final Fantasy 15 on the podcast before, and there's the very infamous Chapter 13 that I've heard has been reworked somewhat since I played it, but I'm sure it's the same sort of thing, in which you're separated from your allies and all your weapons, but the combat mechanic functions the same, right? You still fight enemies, it's just you just only have one weapon to do that with and no friends to help you. So in this case, what was a standard sort of action adventure type low power, high control combat system becomes low power, low control very suddenly, which explains a lot of the negative reactions to this chapter. Like, theoretically, it's supposed to show Noctis at his lowest, so it makes sense why they did it, but perhaps they went too far with it. In a lot of choice-based games, different choices have different amounts of power. So in Life is Strange, for instance, you decide the ending based on a single choice. And there, every choice up until then only matters within the game. And the choice you make at the end sort of determines the ending that you get. So that one choice at the end has like a significantly higher amount of power than every other choice that came before, which again can have sort of positive or negative reactions based on that really sudden slide up the scale. Especially since it also might recontextualize your previous choices to be sort of low power, low control type things, which you may feel negatively about. Right? Or sort of a meta example, we talked about BioShock just recently on the podcast, and there's the very famous sort of would you kindly reveal, in which sort of while like theoretically the mechanic stays the same, it now feels differently, because you realize that the quote-unquote game has been making you do it. Right? So again, that sort of standard high control, low power situation becomes something where you really feel like it was low control, low power all along, even though like technically nothing you did changed and nothing in how the mechanics worked changed. It just revealed story information that sort of replaced the mechanics in your head, right? Sometimes, however, and sort of in that, related to that, I guess, The mechanic might not change at all on the scale, but sort of the situation in which the mechanic is happening evokes different emotions in the player. So I like to use I don't really like to think about the ending of Crisis Core.
This was the big laugh line at the presentation when Emma was like, Crisis Core is weird.
It's a weird game. The ending is really sad. I cried, let's move on from that. But it has sort of this weird combat system. But at the end of the day, it's a combat system, right? You can sort of place it on this quadrant. But the very last fight of Crisis Core sort of sees you taking a last stand in order to protect somebody you care about. And essentially, enemies just keep coming until you die. So you still have the same amount of control over your combat and everything like that. It's just that the odds against you, the AI against you, is so overwhelming that eventually you succumb to it. And obviously, as that continues, you start to feel sort of hopeless and become sad, and you see what's coming, etc., etc. As opposed to sort of the ideal feeling of triumph and not our kind of power, but the colloquial use of power that standard combat wants you to feel. So by placing it in a different situation, the effects of its place on the spectrum is different. Yeah.
So why should you care about all of this? Especially if you're a person just listening to us on the podcast in the comfort of your own home, car, subway, run, whatever. And not someone who was with us, presumably interested in critical analysis of games at a game studies conference. Well, we think that this provides a more structured way of looking at mechanics in a narrative that can really serve as a good starting point for design and critical analysis. If you're into the world of game design and that's something that you like to do and you're interested in that, this offers sort of a language to explain why a certain mechanic works or doesn't work, and a framework to examine why you're using certain mechanics at certain points in the game. Over time in games, right? Obviously, I don't think this is controversial to say, mechanics have become more and more ingrained in storytelling just because storytelling has become more complex. And so as that continues to become more and more closely woven together, it's important to be able to examine critically why you are making certain mechanical choices. But even if you're not into game design, all of us who play games have opinions about whether games are good or bad. Not games in general. If you play games, you probably think games are good. But I mean specific games, about whether you think they're good or bad. And this is a great way to say, okay, instead of just being like, this game is bad. Why? Because I don't like it. To say, this moment didn't work for me because I was feeling really identified with the character, and all of a sudden we snapped into this low power, low control cutscene where my character did something that didn't make sense with the character I thought I was playing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I know cutscenes are not super technically mechanics, but all of a sudden I got thrown into a situation where I was forced to kill someone which I did not think my character would do.
Mm-hmm.
So it gives a language for discussing these kinds of things, which this is not something we actually talked about in the presentation, but especially in a gaming culture where it's a lot of just screaming at people in comments.
Yeah.
Sometimes. It's nice to have something that feels a little bit more... Sometimes it's nice to have something that feels a little bit more academic to talk about this kind of thing and why things work and why things don't. That isn't just this is bad.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, this is not the end-all, be-all of examining mechanics, right? It doesn't necessarily cover every nuance, but it's a really good building block to a greater discussion. And it's, an easy way to sort of test, at least on a one or two levels below the surface level, of whether a mechanic fits or doesn't fit a story or themes of the game at a given point. And Emma does, I think that, this presentation is really heavily based on the work that Emma does in the Play This series, which shows a bunch of ways outside of this framework that you can examine mechanics for why they're functioning or not in a given point of the game. So it's not just this, but this is a really useful starting point.
Heck yeah.
So that was our presentation. In terms of things that I think that we'd love to think more about on this topic, right, is we thought mostly about games that do have like a narrative, right? Ingrained in the game. And to expand this to think about games where emergent narrative is sort of more the primary form of narrative, and what sort of mechanics engender that, I think would be an interesting discussion. As well as just, do some more detailed case studies, because that was fun.
Yeah. I do feel like we have sort of spent some time with, like, case studies that very much illustrate the extremes, and sort of also sort of explain what each one is. But I think, like, the next step would be actually sort of applying this in depth to a game and its mechanic, and talking about sort of the effects it has, and also, like, looking at games that don't think about it at all, or having things that fall somewhere in the middle, and how that impacts the story and stuff like that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Anyway, folks, if you have thoughts about games that might make excellent case studies we're hoping to turn this into a paper in the near future, as opposed to just a presentation. So if you have thoughts about games that might make excellent case studies, if you are trying to apply this to a game you're playing and want to sort of share your thoughts of how it works on a certain moment, that would be super cool. We would like to hear about that. So, if you have those ideas, hey, either comment on the Facebook, Twitter, Instagram posts about this episode, where you can find us on those platforms at Talk This Podcast, or comment on one of Emma's Play This videos, which are all, if you're interested in this podcast, this episode at all, you should go back and watch all of Emma's Play This videos, because she does this, but there are visuals, and it's more in detail. And you don't have to deal with me rambling about things that are off topic and being sarcastic. And there's usually funny, disturbing visuals she's made. So you should go and watch all the Play This series if you're interested in this, because it gets into this in even more detail and more game-specific detail and more nuance than we were able to do in the presentation. So comment on one of those videos if you have thoughts. We'll still see it. We'll know what you're talking about. Or drop us a line on our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can look at other stuff on the blog while you're there. Hey, why the heck not? Think about how various mechanics in Kingdom Hearts cause certain reactions in Clickbait Boyfriend. That's the analysis I want to see. And if you like this, hey, we talk about mechanics and this type of thing all the time. I think a lot of what we talked about on Days Gone last week, like I said, was sort of orbiting around this idea of these sort of similar mechanics that are frequently used, and why do we use them over and over again? What's the purpose of them? Mm-hmm. And you'll certainly probably hear more about that, even though we literally recorded the podcast and picked the games yesterday in real time. I cannot remember what we were talking about on the podcast next week.
Next week we're talking about
Spore and Red Dead Redemption 2. I got it.
Red Dead Redemption 2. You got it. Good job.
There's definitely some interesting mechanics stuff to talk about there.
Yeah.
Certainly Red Dead is sort of beyond the scope of what we examined here, but would be like a great example of the sort of emergent narrative that is so common in games today.
And expect us to be saying Spore in a bad British accent and Red Dead Redemption 2 in a whatever that was. Because I know I'm going to be doing that next episode.
Yeah, so. That'll be great. We'll be doing dialects the whole time. We'll interject with me playing the video where the guy is trying to get the rare horse and he gets mowed down by a moose like every 5 minutes. Yeah, we'll probably talk DRM software. That's a big Spore thing. So, it's going to be a fun time is what I'm saying. So, bring your horse to the Old Town podcast or whatever.
Do you want to sign us off, Malin?
Yeah, folks. I hope you have a high power, high control week.